Hello, my name is Brenda Combs, and I'm one of the co-directors at Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative. Today we're going to talk about compensatory education versus extended school year services. It has become a big issue in the state of Kentucky, and I'm sure all over. Those that are doing the virtual platforms are sort of worried about that. But today we're going to explain the difference between the two. Sometimes we get confused and need it defined. So when you're looking at compensatory education, at the definition, it says when special education and related services are not provided in accordance with the individual education program, regardless of the reason why, it may result in a denial of FAPE. In other words, we have to make sure that we look at our students' IEPs and that we are providing them the services that are written in the IEP. If we are not, then we are in violation of FAPE, in which the student can be awarded compensatory education. So we just need to make sure that we do what is in the IEP for the special education students. Now, when we talk about compensatory education, it's not defined in our regulations. It's a non-regulatory guidance that we use the case laws. And from the case law, this is what becomes of that compensatory education if we have a denial of FAPE. So the districts are charged with a task of reviewing those special education records and making sure that we follow what is in the IEP so that we do not have to have compensatory education. Now, we do have some terms that was used in the document that KDE provided, and some districts felt like the word compensatory education sounded a little negative. So they decided they wanted some words in that place. So some of the words that they came up with was like unfinished learning, lost learning, or post-COVID instruction. Personally, I think compensatory education is probably the one that I would want to use, since that is what we are doing. It is not negative. It's a more of a positive way of helping students in case they do get a denial of FAPE. And we don't do this intentionally. We don't do that intentional, and people know that. So let's just make sure that we try to follow those IEPs, and that way we won't have to worry about compensatory education. The next thing is the extended school year services. Now, when we're looking at the extended school year services, it's defined for us as well. So what we look at here is the specially designed instruction and related services that are provided to the student with a disability beyond the normal school year in accordance to the child's IEP at no cost to the parents. So when we look at ESY, we have to consider, did the child regress a goal or goals that is written in the IEP after a break? So if we go on a break, say Christmas break, and we come back and we check for our students' knowledge to see if they have regressed, and we find that they have, and we give them maybe 6 weeks to recoup that information, and they cannot recoup that information, then this is when the child can have ESY. Now, ESY is only for the goals that the student has regressed and cannot recoup within the 6-week period. So maybe when we do ESY, it's during the summertime, and you only have one goal, maybe that the student has regressed and can't recoup, then that's the only goal that you're going to provide for that student. We don't have any additional goals. So the ARC has to meet and determine, the length of time, those types of things that the student needs to come in for that service. So they had some questions in the KDE document that are really good, that I feel like that we need to get out to the districts. And I don't want to just read these things to you all. I know that you all can read, but with this being such a big issue, I am going to go through all of the questions that KDE had provided in the document. I just sort of put it in a different context here that's written in the document. The document's a little bit longer, and putting it in this format made it a little bit shorter. So the questions are what it is not. So what compensatory education services is not. It's not a personal injury, and it's not a means for child care services. It's not a continuation of the IEP, and it's not used to maximize student potential. When you look over at the ESY, or the Extended School Year Services, what it is not, it's not based on specific category of disability. It's not limited to level or of services or type of placement. It's not used for child care services. And it's not an automatic program that extends from year to year, which means if they qualify for it this year, they don't automatically qualify for it next year. You still have to go through the progress monitoring to determine that. It's not summer school, it's not compensatory education or enrichment services, and it's not required to be provided in traditional classroom settings. It's not a continuation of the entire IEP. Like I said earlier, it's just for the goal that they regressed and could not recoup within the 6-week period. It's not used to maximize students' potential. It's not used to remove the student from age-appropriate general education classrooms solely because he or she requires modifications to the general curriculum. We just need to remember this is for students that have regressed and cannot recoup in that 6-week period. The next question is, when and how can services be provided? Okay, so when you're looking at the compensatory education services, it can be provided before or after regular school hours, as long as it's not during school hours. It can occur. And it may occur as assistance in the form of tutoring. Also, it may be provided by school staff, or it can be a contracted service provider or private service provider, and that will be discussed in your ARC conference summary if you do that route. When you're looking over at the extended school year services, it's provided before or after regular school hours, and in parentheses you see there outside of the instructional day. It may occur during school breaks, and normally it's during the summertime. Designed to increase recoupment and retention of skills. When you're looking at the next question, when is the student eligible for services? Okay, the next question is, when is a student eligible for services? So for compensatory time or compensatory education services, it's necessary when a student has experienced a denial of FAPE that may have occurred as a result of any of these following circumstances. Failure to conduct appropriate IDEA child fine responsibilities, failure to evaluate a student in a timely manner, failure to develop an appropriate IEP, failure to implement an IEP, and failure to address behavior issues. When we look at the compensatory time and we look at those circumstances there, a lot of people just think it is due to just the services for the child. But as you see here, it talks about different things. It talks about we have to do child fine, and we have to do that in order to find or determine if a child is in need of special ed services. That is still a denial of FAPE if you don't do that. Again, the failure to develop an appropriate IEP, this is where the ARC has to make sure that when they meet, they talk about the progress monitoring, or if it's an initial IEP, that they talk about the RTI, those types of things that the student did prior to being tested, to make sure that you write the goals that are necessary. Again, you may have many goals, but we have to prioritize those goals to determine which ones that we really need, because remember, the IEP is for 1 year only, and we can't do a lot of goals in 1 year for the student to master them. So let's just make sure that we write it for the goals for 1 year. And then failure to implement the IEP, we just need to make sure that we are providing those services as I stated before, that is written in that IEP. And again, we must remember that when you're looking at the service minutes in the IEP, that is just an approximate service time. It's not stated that it is a for sure time. So if you've got 15 minutes in there for the service and you only get in 14, that's okay, because it's just an anticipated time. It's not an exact amount. And then again, we have issues right now like with behavior. So we need to make sure that we address behavior issues. We do have problems with receiving referrals, and behavior is not addressed on that referral. And then the student does not qualify for services, and then we have to go back and do RTI for behavior. So if the student has a behavior issue, let's make sure we address it up front and we don't have to redo. When you look over at ESY services, again, the question is, when is a student eligible for services? Determined annually by the ARC in accordance with the IEP and as close as possible to the student's normal placement. The next one is designed so that a student can more readily maintain previous acquired or learned skills. So when we look at each side of these, we have to remember the definition of both of those services and what they are, and it helps us to determine when they need the services. The next question is, how are the amounts of services determined? So we do know that we always have to have ARC's meetings to make sure that the entire committee is in on this. That includes the parents, to see how long the child may need these services. So when you're looking at compensatory time, you review the analysis and the data that's in front of you. It could be progress monitoring, it could be RTI, it could be a lot of different things. We just need to make sure we have all of the data in front of us as we talk about it at the meeting. Begins to accrue from the time the school district knew or should have known the district's experience a denial of FAPE. So once you find out that you have denied a child of FAPE, that's when you need to have the meeting, because you need to know, the parent needs to know right up front, we made a mistake and we are willing to fix this, and this is how we are going to fix this. When you do that, the parents will understand it better and see that you do care, that you brought it up first, and they didn't have to go through the hoops and the loops of trying to get through to determine if their child didn't get the FAPE. A minute per minute calculation, or you can do a qualitative calculation. Most of the time, districts do a qualitative calculation. They don't do a minute per minute, but it's still left up to the ARC. It's not left up to me, and it's not left up to anybody else except the ARC committee. When you look over at the ESY, it says that it's determined annually, and what we normally do is we look at your progress, at the student's progress monitoring, to see if they've had any regression. So we look at the data points, and of course, I'm not going to go through progress monitoring right now, but the data points play a big role in this because once you do have a break in services, like I said, it's a Christmas break maybe, and you come back and the child has an issue with retaining that information, and you teach it for 6 weeks, and they still have some problems retaining it, then the child is qualified and can have ESY services. And again, it's decided upon the ARC. And please make sure that you document both the compensatory time as well as your ESY services in your conference summary. It needs to be in there, because if it's not written down, it didn't happen, and in case something does happen and it does go to court, you'll have all that information there in the conference summary. So some important things that we need to remember for both the compensatory education and the ESY services. The compensatory education is a remedy provided to the student when you have a denial of FAPE. It's designed to put the student in the place he or she would have otherwise been if there had not been a denial of FAPE. The ARC must develop an individualized implementation plan for compensatory education services and document the decisions that the ARC made in the conference summary. Ongoing progress monitoring should be collected. The district assumes all costs of providing compensatory education services. A special education teacher must provide the specially designed instruction, and the appropriate related service provider must provide the related services. A district must provide transportation for the student. A service log should be maintained by the district to document when compensatory education services are provided and by whom. And for preschool students, if the compensatory education is provided during a different preschool session, the session cannot exceed the class size of 20. Now, when we look over at the ESY, we see that the service provided by the student with instruction and support so that he or she can more readily maintain previous acquired learned skills. And ESY services are determined annually by the ARC. A special education teacher must provide the specially designed instruction required, and the appropriate related service provider must provide the related services. The district must provide transportation. The ARC must develop an ESY plan to include when and how services will be provided. District should maintain a detailed log of ESY services as they are provided to the student and maintained in the student's due process folder. ESY must be individualized and cannot be one-size-fits-all approach for all students in the district who qualify. For the compensatory education services, the district should maintain a detailed log of the compensatory education services as they are provided to the student, including ongoing progress monitoring, and this should be maintained in the student's due process folder. So now here comes the questions that people have asked KDE, and they have put it on paper in writing so that everybody would have the answers. And I'm going to go over those with you. Again, bear with me because this is so important. I feel like I'm reading to you, but I feel this is very, very, very important to know and to understand so that we can keep ourselves out of trouble. So the first question is, what definition should we use for compensatory education services resulting from COVID-19? All right, so the definition of compensatory education has not been changed because of COVID-19. The IDEA case law allows for districts, state agencies, hearing officers, and courts to award compensatory education to a student with a disability as an appropriate remedy when the educational authority has failed to provide the student with FAPE. Here we have some case law that you can look up if you want to. I won't go over that with you, but it's there in case you want to look it up. While it is typical for compensatory education to be awarded through the dispute resolution process, there is nothing to prevent local ARCs from determining and acknowledging that a denial of FAPE has occurred and offering compensatory education as a viable remedy. Doing so may prevent initiation of a dispute resolution process on an award of compensatory education as possible attorney fees if such a process were initiated. Must districts provide compensatory education for missed services that were solely due to COVID-19, forcing districts to move to remote instruction? Districts did nothing wrong, so why are we saying there has been a denial of FAPE? So the answer is yes. And beginning with the Deal 4 case that was in the Sixth Circuit, the FAPE standard was set to confer meaningful educational benefit to all students with disabilities. The Supreme Court then heightened the standard for FAPE in the Andrew 5 case. ARCs are required by NDRU to construct IEPs that are reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. When reasonable calculations, the student's IEP, the student's ARC determines specific services were necessary to provide the student of a FAPE and ensure the student was able to make progress in light of their circumstances. While COVID-19 may have caused some IEP services to cease, that does not change the obligation of the district to provide a FAPE to that student. When a student with an IEP does not receive a FAPE, regardless of the reason why, the district shall provide a remedy for the IDEA non-compliance. The ARC shall make an individualized determination as to whether a student requires compensatory education and determine the specific plan for providing services to those students who are owed compensation. What special education and related services must be provided to students when IEPs during times of brief school closures, when schools are not yet providing educational services to any students? When school is closed due to COVID-19 outbreak and is not yet providing any services to the general student population, the school is not required to provide IEP services. This is just like being out for summer break. The fourth question is, if a student with a disability has needs that are too complex for the district to reasonably provide through remote instruction, and the district is unable to conduct face-to-face instruction as a result of a threat to public health, what should the district do? District should provide the IEP services it feasibly can through remote instruction. Districts must make a good faith effort to provide comparable alternative IEP services. If the district is unable to provide these types of services through virtual learning or other alternative means available to the student, the ARC must determine the extent to which compensatory services, if any, will need to be provided once the district has resumed standard operations and face-to-face services can be provided. So when you're looking at this kind of thing, we just have to remember that when we get into situations, we have to make sure that we have ARC meetings. We have to talk about these things, and we have to put those in the conference summary so that we'll understand if it ever comes up in the future, what we have discussed and the plan that we came up with and what we're going to be providing to the student. Compensatory education. Can compensatory education be awarded past a student's 22nd birthday? Yes. The purpose of compensatory education is to place a student in a position he or she would have been if there had been no IDEA violation. If the student was between the ages of 3 and 21, when the denial of FAPE occurred, the student still is eligible for compensatory education as a remedy, even if the student is past the age of 21. Number 6, can students who graduated during the COVID-19 outbreak be awarded compensatory education? Again, that's sort of similar to the one above. Yes, graduation does not automatically relieve the districts of its obligation to remedy the past failure to provide FAPE. Compensatory education can assist a student in a broader educational purposes of the IDEA, including obtaining a job or living independently. However, compensatory education must be the type of educational and related services that are part of elementary and secondary school education offered by the districts, not post-secondary education. So we do have a letter to Rifle, August 22nd, 2000. So if you're interested in that, you can go and look that up on the KDE website and or Google it, either one. and you can read about that. Number 7, can an ARC award compensatory education services to students in preschool if they did not receive their IEP services during the NTI period? Yes. Compensatory education is available to all students with the IEP. So you can also refer to the answer there for A1 when you're looking at this. Okay, so here, when you're looking at the question 1 and you're looking at that answer, I'm not going to go ahead and read it over again, but when you're looking at the definition, when should we use a compensatory education? Remember, it is any time that we deny services to a special education student, and we need to go ahead and have a meeting and get it over with, and get our plan made and go ahead with the situation. If not, the parent could actually go ahead and take you to court, and we don't want that. We want the parents to know that we have made a mistake and that we need to correct it. Number 8, are districts required to provide compensatory education if ARCs miss the deadline and do not determine a student's eligibility through an initial evaluation, re-evaluation, or a review of existing data during the NTI period? So, compensatory education must be provided based on the date the evaluation should have been completed. Neither OSEP nor OSIL has the authority to waive or extend any timeline requirements for initial evaluations or a 3-year re-eval, as stipulated under the IDEA. If the district is in the process of completing the initial evaluation during the NTI period, the district should diligently complete all the components of the evaluation that can safely be done. If an initial evaluation or a 3-year re-eval of the student is needed, the district should document its good faith efforts to complete a 3-year re-evaluation or initial evaluation when the required timelines as specified under the IDEA and the Kentucky regulations. The requirement for completing a 3-year re-evaluation does not always necessitate conducting full evaluations. If an ARC determines it has enough current evaluation data and information to confirm the student's initial eligibility or continued eligibility as a student with a disability who needs special education and related services, has enough information to write an appropriate IEP for the student, then the ARC could agree to make the student's eligible determination based upon a review of existing assessment data and educational records. If due to COVID-19, the ARC is unable to make a determination of the student's eligibility and, as a result, is unable to appropriately develop, update, or revise the student's IEP, the ARC may decide that the student has experienced a denial of FAPE. All right, can an ARC award compensatory education services if there is an IEP implementation delay during a student's move from Part C to Part B? What we're looking at when we look at Part C and Part B, we're looking at your preschool Head Start programs. So yes, districts shall implement IEPs from student transitioning from Part B as soon as possible, ideally leaving no discontinuity between the determination of Part C services and the commencement of Part B services. The inability to implement the IEP without a gap in services could lead to a failure to provide FAPE. However, U.S. Department of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos requested a waiver from Congress that would extend the evaluation timeline for children making the transition from federal special education services for infants and toddlers under the Part C of the IDEA to Part B of the IDEA. At this time, Congress has not acted upon the request. Number 10, How do districts determine the amount of compensatory education awarded? There are two ways to approach this. One is the minute-for-minute approach, and the other one is a qualitative approach. In the qualitative approach, the analysis for determining whether a student needs compensatory education and how much may be determined by the effect of the loss of educational benefit the student experienced based on their unique situation. And this may require the ARC to examine both the qualitative and quantitative benefits the student would be received had the student been offered FAPE. There is no cookie-cutter approach to the analysis of data, since each student's educational needs are specialized, or his or her educational program is uniquely designed for the student. ARCs must determine which approach is most appropriate based on the individual circumstances of each student. ARC should consider whether a student has made progress and how much while receiving NTI services as part of its individualized determination and to the student's potential need for compensatory education. Should all students with IEPs receive compensatory educational services once face-to-face instruction resumes? No. The ARC must make decisions on a case-by-case basis. This means you do look at your students' IEPs. You do look to see how many minutes that the child received from that IEP for that goal or goals. And if you find that you have failed and they did receive denial of FAPE, then this is when we need to talk about it. We don't need to have a long, drawn-out conversation with the parent. We just need to go ahead and let them know that there was a denial of FAPE and that we would like to correct that. Number 12, when should the ARC meet to discuss compensatory educational services? And I think I pretty much said that earlier, but anyway, information needed to make this determination may not be known until after the interruption in services has ended. Thus, the most appropriate time for the ARC to decide on compensatory education for the student would be when schools return to face-to-face instruction. Districts must consider prioritizing meetings based upon student needs and progress. What if the district and the parent cannot agree on compensatory education decisions? If the district and the parents were unable to agree on compensatory education decisions, the district should make the determination to provide the parent with prior written notice. The parent or the district may initiate dispute resolution procedures to resolve the disagreement. How can districts fund compensatory education services for students who did not receive FAPE during the COVID-19 NTI period? Districts have the option of using a variety of funding sources to pay the cost of providing compensatory education services. These sources include state and local funds, IDEA funds, funds available under the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, including Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief and Governor's Emergency Education Relief funds. While it may be tempting for a district to use the CARES funding to pay for these services, OCIL cautions local districts to review their maintenance of effort required to ensure the districts continue to spend from state and local sources an amount necessary to maintain effort and be in compliance with the fiscal requirements of IDEA. Now, I will not go into the maintenance of physical effort. That would be the Director of Special Education and your finance officer, and they can discuss that part of that. What if the student asks to discontinue or declines services? Well, the ARC must convene to discuss, plan, and agree to compensatory education services before the district initiates providing such services. After the district has begun providing compensatory education services to the student, the ARC will need to reconvene prior to discontinuing the services. The ARC must document the discussion and decline of compensatory education services in the ARC conference summary. The service provider should be included in the ARC meeting that is convened with the purpose of deciding whether to discontinue compensatory education services. So the parents have the right to decline. And when they do decline the services, then the school district needs to put in there if they agree with it or if they don't agree with it. This will show that the school district does have a voice because the parents are, yes, they are the parents, but the education falls on the teacher, and they teach the child and they understand the child's educational needs. So we need to put those pieces in that conference summary in case something comes about that. But yes, the parent does have the right to deny services, and once they do deny the right, then the education agency is no longer responsible for doing that. As schools reopen and consider a hybrid model of face-to-face and remote instruction, should schools amend IEPs to reflect the environmental change? Any change to the student's IEP must be made by the ARC. The ARC can consider alternate ways to provide specially designed instruction and related services during this time. However, the IEP must be based on individual needs. IEPs cannot be developed to accommodate scheduling needs or administrative convenience. That is all the questions that they had for the compensatory education services. Now we're going to go to the extended school year services. The first question is, should an ARC add extended school year services to every child's IEP to provide compensatory services when school resumes normal operations next school year? No. The purpose of ESY is not to provide compensatory education services. They're two different things. Remember, FAPE is denial of services, and your ESY is when a child has regression and recoupment issues. The second question is, how should schools address the provision of ESY services for students whose IEPs require ESY during the summer of 2020? ESY services must be provided in accordance with the student's IEP. ESY services are not automatically canceled if scheduled summer school programs are canceled. These are two different programs. Summer school is different from ESY. Districts should take diligent steps to implement ESY services as closely as possible to what is specified in the student's IEP during the summer break to the greatest extent possible. The inability to implement ESY services provided for the IEP may be a denial of FAPE, resulting in compensatory education. Do districts need to provide all students with ESY services due to the COVID-19 outbreak? No. Each student's ARC determines whether the individual student needs ESY services based on individualized data. The ARC must analyze the student's tendencies to regress, prior regression, ability to recoup lost skills, and progress toward educational goals. If the ARC determines a student needs ESY, it must specify these services in the student's IEP. Question number 4. What factors should the ARC consider when determining whether a student needs ESY services? The ARC, with parental involvement and input, makes the determination of ESY on an individual basis after a thorough review of the individual student's progress on goals and objectives. An ARC may consider several factors when determining whether a student requires ESY services. A common factor ARCs will consider when deciding a student's need for ESY is the amount of regression the student experienced over long breaks in instruction, and the length of time the student took to recoup skills and instruction has resumed. So if you need any further information about that guidance, then you can look on page 64 of your IEP guidance document. Question number 5. For students with already identified ESY service needs, how will the NTI period related to COVID-19 impact the provision of these services? The need for ESY services is a student-specific determination, and as such, each student's ARC must determine whether a student qualifies for ESY services because of school closures related to COVID-19. If a student was determined to need ESY services prior to NTI due to COVID-19, then the district still is obligated to provide those services. Question number 6. May a student receive both compensatory education and ESY services during the same school year? The answer is yes. The need for ESY and compensatory education services are independently determined by the student's ARC. What we do is, if we see that the child had a denial of FAPE, then we are going to address the compensatory education services. And if we see that the child has regressed and has issues recouping, then we're going to address the ESY services. So if a student is eligible to receive one of the services, it does not preclude them from receiving the other. It's based on individual student need. I thank you for listening to me, and if you have any questions about compensatory time or extended school year services, you can contact me here at Kentucky Valley Education Cooperative. My email address is brenda.combs2@hazard.kyschools.us, or you can call or text me. The number is area code 606-854-4365. Again, thank you for listening to me.